So patient's gonna be seated. We're gonna be doing seated occiput for left rotation restriction. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my pointer finger, place it on the right occiput, and then my middle finger is gonna go on the posterior aspect of C1 atlas. I'm gonna use my indifferent hand, rotate the patient's head, and then press on the occiput, feeling for the restriction. And then if we're gonna go into the adjustment, I'm gonna tissue select out onto the posterior aspect of the occiput. Patient's going to rest their head into my hand, creating that kickstand. My indifferent hand is going to be facing forward since it's rotation. I'm going to laterally flex over, step inside, rotate away, and then I would impulse at the end of my adjustment. For TMJ, either supine or seated. If we choose supine, I'm going to instruct the patient to open up her jaw, close it, and then I'll ask her to protrude it out and then retract it. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my fingers at the TMJ. Go ahead and open it, close it, retract and protract. Retract. Yeah. All right, from here I can move into the adjustment. So if I felt it restricted on the right, I'm going to rotate the patient's head over my contact, placing my pisiform along the TMJ. I'm then going to come around to my work, long axis distract, and then I would impulse at the end of it. Doing a T1 adjustment for a right lateral flexion restriction. So first we're going to assess it. So I'm going to place the patient's left arm on my knee. I'm going to use a index contact on T1. I'm going to use my indifferent hand. I'm going to bring my patient over, laterally flex over my contact, and spring P to A, feeling for the restriction. And if there was a restriction, I would bring her out further, bring her to end feel, and then I would impulse through the T1 right lateral flexion restriction. We're showing how to assess the thoracic spine. So I'm going to have my patient place her fingertips on her ipsilateral shoulders. I'm going to contact the front and bring her into a forward flex position. What I'm going to do from here is take a calcaneal heel contact and spring P to A on the spinous processes, feeling for springiness. I can then rotate my patient away or towards me, pressing P to A on the opposite TPs. And then I can laterally flex my patient away, pressing P to A. And then I can do the same thing on the other side. Rotating her towards me, opposite TPs, going down, and then laterally flex, stringing P to A. So patient is prone. I'm going to do an adjustment for T6 right rotation restriction and right lateral flexion restriction. So I'm going to find T6, find this gap, T7, work my way up to T6. I'm going to place my empathy in our contact and induce clockwise torque. I'm going to reinforce with my palmar contact on my hand, and then I'm going to stress and then impulse P to A with more clockwise torque. Patient's going to be seated. Can I have contact your hand? I'm going to use my outside hand to induce the arm into more pronation. I'm going to use my thumb on the radial head, and then while inducing more pronation, I can spring P to A on the radial head, and that would be the assessment, and then I can move into the adjustment. And for the adjustment, I would do test plus impulse. So once I get it to that end feel, I would then press P to A with quick extension. Good. So patient's going to be supine. I'm going to place their arm in a 90-90 position. I'm going to be in a modified Fencer stance, placing their arm onto my knee. I'm going to use a bilateral palmar grasp, and I'm just going to induce more internal rotation, just seeing if there's a restriction at all, and if there was a restriction, using that same grasp, I would do test plus impulse, so I'd bring it to their end field, and I would impulse with more internal rotation. Patient's going to be seated. I'm going to use an index contact in the proximal row of the carpals, reinforcing, and then my thumbs are going to be reinforced on top. Once the patient's leaning away, and I'm just going to put the wrist into more flexion, feeling for the springiness, and if there was a restriction, I would do test plus impulse. So as the patient leans away, I would induce more long axis distraction. All right, we're assessing TL junctions. I'm going to ask the patient to place her fingertips on her ipsilateral shoulders. I'm going to come in front of my patient, bring her forward body into flexion, if she lets me, and then I'm going to place my calcaneal heel contact on the spinous processes. Calcaneal heel contacts and the spinous processes at the TL junction, springing P to A, feeling for springiness, and then I'm going to rotate my patient towards me, pressing P to A on the opposite TPs, and then I'm going to laterally flex my patient, placing my fingertips, feeling for the closure. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Bring her forward, rotate her towards me, springing P to A on opposite TPs, and then I'll laterally flex her over, feeling that space close with my digital contact. Patient's seated at the end of the table, arms crossed. I would be using the back piece of a thoracic board, but this table is hard enough so we don't have to. I'm going to use my intrathenar contact in the spinous process. I'm adjusting, contacting the patient's arms in the front. I'm going to be in a modified defensive stance on either side. Let my patient breathe in, breathe out, and then as I lay them down, I will then impulse. We're going to assess for internal rotation restriction, so the patient's going to be supine. I'm going to bring the leg up into a 90-90 position, and then I'm going to externally rotate the leg, inducing internal rotation of the hip. So, doing the same thing on the other side. Testing to see which side is worse, or feeling more restricted. So if your left side was more restricted, we're going to do a tug of war position. I'm going to be at the end of the table. The patient will still be supine. I am going to do a wax on, wax off. So I'm reinforcing at the ankle with my other hand. I'm going to make sure my back's straight. I'm going to be in a modified defensive stance. And then I would do test plus impulse with that internal rotation. Patient is laying face down. We're assessing for fibular head, so I'm going to bring the leg up. I'm going to place a pisiform contact on that fibular head, reinforcing. I can give it a little impulse to see if it's restricted. And if it was restricted, I would do test plus impulse, so I would distract the leg, and then I would impulse P to A. We're assessing for a dorsal to plantar restriction, so I'm going to use a reinforced thumb contact, dorsiflex the foot, and then I'm just feeling if there is a restriction. If there was a restriction, I would go into a bunny hop position, placing that reinforced thumb, or placing that thumb over the cuboid, and then I'm going to use my gold contact, reinforcing with my fingers on the plantar surface of the foot. I will bunny hop, long axis distract, and then I would do test plus impulse. So patient's prone, we're assessing for plantar to dorsal. I'm going to use a reinforced thumb contact on the plantar surface of the foot. While my fingers rest on the dorsal surface, I'm just going to distract and spring P to A, feeling for any restriction. If there was, I'm then going to place a pisiform contact on the plantar surface of the foot, my calcaneal contact on the dorsum of the foot. I'm going to long axis distract, and then I'm going to test this impulse.